With the Prime Minister today declaring that he'd like to put a ban on the radical Islamic organisation Hizb ut-Tahrir, spokesman for the group, Wasim Darihi, joins me now. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
We've invited you here tonight to help Australians better understand what it is that you stand for. So tell me, first of all, do you support the murderous campaign being waged by Islamic State fighters in Iraq?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. There is an urgent need in this country to have quite open and honest conversation. I want to take a moment just to take a step back.
But I would like you to take this moment to my question, only because we'll have some time to go through a number of issues, and I don't want to run out of time.
We won't run out of time. We'll definitely address the most important and pertinent points. The first point is this, that when we discuss the events in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, our entry point shouldn't be what ISIS is doing or not doing. ISIS exists in a particular context. What's that context? That context is a century more of colonial occupation.
And I don't want to talk to you about the context at this point in time. I want you to address the very specific nature of my question, which is the tactics that this group is employing. Do you support them or not?
The fact that we don't want to have this discussion now is indicative of where the entire discussion around the war on terror narrative goes. The fact is, the entire response is what Muslims are doing or may not be doing. But no one legitimately or sincerely is discussing what Western governments are doing in the Muslim world. Groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda don't exist in a vacuum. They exist as a reaction to Western interference in the Islamic lands, and they view themselves, rightfully or wrongfully, irrespective of my opinion or otherwise, as a resistance effort to what they regard as an unjust occupation.
And with respect, many commentators all over the world have made that very point. What I'm asking you specifically is their tactics. Of course people are angry, we understand that, but what I'm asking you is the tactic that's being employed to push back. Do you support it?
Well, let me explain something very clearly.
Answer my question, please.
I'll explain to you why the question itself is quite disconcerting. Because what we're talking about is a particular reality where millions have lost their lives. Countries have been destroyed.
You are clearly obfuscating, and I did not invite you onto this program.
I reject the accusation. I'll say very clearly.
Why will you not point blank condemn the actions of IS
because
fighters?
The question itself is offensive.
Men who cut off the heads of innocent journalists and aid workers. Why will you not take the opportunity? You have a national platform here. Why don't you adopt the leadership that many have obviously given you responsibility for?
Why won't you allow me to answer the question that I deem appropriate? I've answered the question quite directly. We're talking about a reality in which millions have lost their lives directly as a consequence of the foreign policies of countries like Australia.
And you have made that point,
but
and
what
I allowed you to make that point.
What hasn't been made is what are we going to do about it?
Will make their own judgments
and of course they will. And I have absolute trust in the Australian population.
And now I would just draw you back to my question.
And I'll keep repeating the same point. This cannot possibly be our entry point in this discussion. Because why is the attention on ISIS, what ISIS is doing or not doing? Our position on ISIS is very clear. Our position on ISIS was released years before Tony Abbott wanted to make it a political issue.
Okay, for those who haven't read it, tell me.
We come from a very clear perspective. Our moral compass is not based on political expediency. Assad has been slaughtering hundreds of thousands, and Tony Abbott has not moved a single fighter jet to oust him from his position. How are we supposed to believe that this current mission is a humanitarian one when
because we were invited in by a legitimately elected government in Iraq?
On a matter of principles.
Syria is in the midst of a civil war. That is a separate conversation to the one we are discussing here.
We're talking principles.
I am discussing with you the tactics of a group that is masquerading behind a religion which many people who follow that religion do not agree with and in fact condemn. People like community leaders here in Australia, like Dr. Jamal Rifi, who has publicly condemned the actions of Islamic State. Why won't you do the same?
My clear position is that we took a clear position on ISIS long before Western politicians wanted to use ISIS as the latest bogeyman. Let's not forget that 1 million people lost their lives based on a lie. Based on a lie. Let's not forget the whole charade around the weapons of mass destruction.
I don't think people forget that. And there have been
Tony Abbott is wanting us to believe that the greatest threat to all of us is the actions of a group, of a handful of individuals, and no one wants to discuss what has caused the death of a million civilians in Iraq?
Are you outraged by the image of an Australian-born child of 7 years old holding up severed heads like trophies in Iraq or Syria?
Let me tell you what I am outraged by.
So you won't even answer that question.
Are you going to allow me to answer the question? Are you going to allow me to answer the question? If you wanted a one-way discussion,
no.
If you wanted a one-day discussion,
I think you're the one who wanted the one-way discussion.
You did not necessarily have to invite me.
I am asking you legitimate questions, which you have obviously come here knowing you didn't want to answer. No,
because you're not getting the answer you want. Because you're not getting the answer you want.
In many cases, I just want a yes or no.
Let me make it very clear. You've invited me onto this platform to express my views.
Yes.
You're not allowing me to do that.
But you want to express your views quite separate to the questions that I'm putting to you.
I'm answering the question.
Okay, let me ask you a different question, and let's see if you might engage with that one. Your group is calling for a caliphate governed by Sharia law. What would that look like in Australia?
This is the absurdity of this entire discussion. Why is the focus, given the context of the war on terror, entirely upon what Muslims are doing or not doing?
Okay, let me ask you another one. Okay, you're not going to engage with that one.
No, let me be very clear. Just because you don't get the answer you want, just because I'm not reinforcing an Islamophobic narrative that justifies the wholesale slaughter of entire populations.
Any supposed
I'm explaining the context in which this entire discussion is happening.
Putting a line in the sand
all you're doing is reinforcing the view.
Yes or a no about what your position is. We can continue to talk over each other.
Your job is to ask the questions and to listen to my response. If you wanted to push an agenda, let's swap seats.
But
if you wanted to communicate a position,
my job is not to ask questions and have you answer something entirely different.
Your job is to ask the question and to canvass my opinions. That's why I was introduced into this program. If you wanted to dictate my response, if you wanted to dictate terms of acceptability, then take my position. But ask me a question and at least afford me the respect for the opportunity to answer it. I come from a very clear point of view that as Muslims, we have a fixed moral compass that says it's unequivocally, under any conditions, it's an aberration to kill innocent civilians. Tony Abbott cannot say that. John Howard dismissed the slaughter of half a million.
Okay, let's
dismissed the slaughter of 500,000 civilians as an embarrassment. Let's talk about morality here. Let's talk about who is the greatest threat to civilian life.
I think people are very clear of your point of view. They're clear on that point of view. You've expressed it a number of times.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you this.
My message is this is where the discussion needs to be.
Will you take this opportunity now to urge young Muslim men here in Australia not to join Islamic State fighters in Iraq and Syria?
And I'll answer it the exact same way. The war on terror narrative works in this way. It presents the West as the good guy and Muslims as the bad guy, and we are what represents an existential threat to the entire world. That's an absurdity. It is not Muslims who are flying B-52s. It is not Muslims who are dropping bombs from their fighter jets. It is not Muslims who are occupying foreign lands.
But it is Islamic State fighters
don't come to me and pretend that the greatest threat to all of us...
They're killing Christians.
We're talking about
They're murdering Kurds.
I'm glad you raised that point. Do you know why? Because how are we expected to believe that the West is concerned about the life of minorities when it is the majority that is being slaughtered? How are we supposed to take those arguments seriously? How are we supposed to take the moral compass seriously when people like Madeleine Albright dismisses lives of 500,000 or 1 million through sanctions?
Will you answer just one question that I
I'm answering very clearly.
Specifically addressing the question I'm asking you?
Just because you don't like the answer doesn't mean I'm not answering the question.
But will you do me a favour and answer one question?
I'm doing the public a great favour by refocusing this discussion where it needs to be. Ask yourselves very clearly, the Australian public... I believe in the Australian public more than Tony Abbott does. I believe that as human beings, they will identify with innocent life taken wrongly anywhere around the world.
What will the Australian public make of the fact that you will not sit here and tell your fellow Muslim men not to join Islamic State fighters in Iraq and Syria?
I believe 100% that the Australian public will see through the rhetoric. Tony Abbott and others who adopt his script are famous for their dog whistle politics, are famous for their policies around marginalisation and xenophobia. That's not some great new revelation. They campaign on this basis specifically because they don't want to confront the truth. And the truth is, it is not Muslims who are occupying foreign lands. It is not Muslims who are killing millions of civilians. And it is not Muslims who are shaking hands with barbaric tyrants.
Where are we occupying foreign lands?
Barbaric tyrants.
Where are we occupying foreign lands?
After 300,000 lives have been lost in Syria.
Okay, now I'm engaging with your comments. Where are we?
Iraq, Afghanistan,
We're not
supporting
occupying
an
Iraq.
international architecture that enslaves entire population.
We're not occupying Iraq.
You can place whatever spin you like. We live it.
The democratically elected government in Iraq has invited us in.
And that's why, as a Muslim, I'm telling the Australian public the reality of what this government is doing in our lands. We live it. It's not an academic exercise.
No, you're living in Australia. You're an Australian resident.
It's not about point
scoring. You're an Australian citizen.
The Australian public
you're
needs
not
to
living
know.
anything
We need
in
to
Iraq.
have an honest conversation about what this government is doing in your name. And it is frightening. John Howard dismissed 500,000 lives as a mere embarrassment, and he did it in the people's name.
In your name.
In the people's name. And this is the dilemma. You want the focus, you want the world to believe that what is of greatest concern is what a handful of individuals are doing in response
like
to what is being done upon them.
There are about 30,000 now.
Let's talk about the other side. Let's talk about the fact that they exist as a reaction to what exists on the ground. What exists on the ground? Foreign occupation, political repression.
Does that justify beheading? Does that justify the slaughter of innocents?
The subjectivity around this discussion? Why don't you condemn what the Australian government is doing? Why don't you condemn what the American government is doing? Why don't you condemn the innocent killing of 1 million lives in Iraq and Afghanistan? Why don't you do that? Why don't you hold the government to account?
We're out of time, surprise.
Very conveniently.
Well, we are out of time. We don't have an infinite amount of time to talk to you, but thanks for coming in nonetheless.
It is my pleasure.